A police officer shot a young boy's German shepherd for no reason, completely unaware that his father was an FBI agent. What happened next will leave you speechless. 18-year-old Jaden Allen stepped outside, feeling the warmth of the afternoon sun wrap around him like a comforting blanket. The vibrant rays mirrored his excitement as he looked down at his birthday gift, a majestic German shepherd named Buddy, with a glossy black and tan coat, alert ears standing tall and strong, confident strides. Buddy was more than just a pet, he was a companion who brought joy and comfort. Jaden had always loved dogs, and Buddy was the perfect match for him, a special gift from his father to celebrate his transition into adulthood. As they strolled down the quiet neighborhood street, joy bubbled within Jaden. He smiled proudly, holding Buddy's leash in one hand. The dog walked obediently at his side, his tail wagging in enthusiastic delight, occasionally glancing up at Jaden with adoration. Jaden felt an extraordinary swell of joy. Their connection had deepened over the past few days, mastering new tricks and commands that showcased Buddy's intelligence and training. The occasional admiring glance from neighbors added to Jaden's pride as they passed, highlighting the beautiful bond between boy and dog. However, the peaceful walk was abruptly interrupted when a police cruiser slowed to a stop near the curb. Jaden glanced up, his heart racing as the driver's door swung open, revealing Officer Mark Stevens. Known for his arrogance and prejudice, the officer approached with an air of authority, causing Jaden's stomach to churn. For a moment, Officer Stevens stood silently, his gaze lingering on Buddy, sharp eyes narrowing as if assessing the dog like a threat. Jaden shifted his weight nervously, adrenaline coursing through him. The silence stretched uncomfortably, and he could feel a knot tightening in his stomach as he waited for the officer to speak. Finally, Officer Stevens broke the silence, his tone dripping with condescension. Tilting his head, he asked, "Who does that dog belong to? And how much are you getting paid to walk him?" The question stunned Jaden. For a second, confusion washed over him like a cold wave. "No one is paying me anything," he replied, his voice respectful yet tremorous, trying to hold on to his composure. Officer Stevens' lips curled into a mocking smile. He crossed his arms, repeating himself as he accused Jaden of walking the dog for free. Jaden shook his head firmly, a mixture of confusion and frustration brewing inside him. "The dog belongs to me. Buddy is a gift from my dad," he explained, hoping to clear the misunderstanding. But the officer's laughter erupted suddenly, echoing down the street. "This dog?" Officer Stevens scoffed between fits of amusement. "How could someone like you afford him?" Jaden tightened his grip on the leash, anger and confusion washing over him, causing his heart to race. "He's mine," he insisted, his voice shaking yet steady. "My dad gave him to me," he repeated, feeling a bitterness in his tone. In an instant, the officer's amusement vanished, replaced by a hard, scrutinizing glare. "You're telling me you own this dog?" he demanded, stepping even closer, his voice sharp and accusatory. "So you stole him, then?" The accusation punched Jaden in the gut, sending a chill through him. He could hardly comprehend Officer Stevens' words. Panic surged as he tried to protest, his voice trembling yet insistent. "No, I didn't steal him. He's not stolen, he's mine." Officer Stevens loomed dangerously close, his body language radiating aggression. "If he's yours," he said coldly, eyes narrowing, "prove it." Frustrated and desperate to show Buddy's training, Jaden knelt beside him. With a calm yet confident voice, he issued one of the commands he had practiced that morning. Buddy barked once, obediently and enthusiastically, just as Jaden had taught him. But that sound seemed to trigger something dark in Officer Stevens' mind. Without warning, the officer's hand shot to the gun holstered at his hip, and he drew it instantly. "You're trying to sick the dog on me," he shouted, his voice rising sharply, filled with adrenaline and hostility. Jaden's eyes widened in disbelief, helplessness washing over him. "No, it's a misunderstanding," he shouted back, desperation creeping into his voice. But Officer Stevens was not listening. The tension in the air escalated into something palpable. With the officer's weapon drawn and the threat of violence looming, Buddy sensed his owner's fear and barked defensively. Jaden felt panic seize him. "Buddy, stop," he yelled, trying to calm his loyal friend, pulling hard on the leash. "He's not attacking you, please." The officer's gun remained steady, finger tightening on the trigger. In a split second, The deafening crack of the gunshot echoed down the street, louder than Jaden could have imagined. Time slowed as he watched Buddy collapse, the life draining from his loyal friend's eyes. Heartbreaking disbelief overwhelmed Jaden as he dropped to his knees, the leash slipping from his trembling hands as he reached for Buddy. "Buddy!" he cried, voice breaking as tears streamed down his face. He cradled the dog's head in his arms, whispering apologies as guilt and sorrow washed over him. Buddy's breaths came shallow and weak, each one cutting through Jaden like a blade. Then Officer Stevens' voice broke through the moment, cold and accusing. "You tried to make that dog attack me," he said flatly, as if his actions were justified. Jaden couldn't comprehend what he was hearing, grief and shock leaving him momentarily speechless. The officer grabbed him roughly by the arm, pulling him to his feet. The cold steel of handcuffs clicked into place around his wrists, and as Officer Stevens led him toward the police cruiser, Jaden's gaze remained fixed on Buddy's lifeless body, lying motionless on the sidewalk. The dog's glossy coat no longer gleamed in the sunlight. The street, once filled with vibrant life, now felt eerily silent and empty. As Jaden was placed into the back seat of the cruiser, his sobs filled the enclosed space, a raw pain that felt unbearable. Officer Stevens drove away, leaving behind Buddy's lifeless form to lie alone in the open air, a painful reminder of what had just been lost. Meanwhile, at the police station, Jaden sat alone in a cold, dimly lit holding room, the cuffs pinching his wrists, sore from their tight grip. The stark metal surface of the table reflected the tears streaming down his face, yet he could not stop crying. The haunting image of Buddy, his loyal friend, lying motionless replayed in his mind like a broken record. It was a nightmare he couldn't escape, the sound of the gunshot echoing through his thoughts over and over again. The room was silent, the only sounds coming from the dull hum of the fluorescent lights above. Jaden wiped his face with the back of his sleeve, his chest tight with grief and humiliation. Everything that had transpired felt surreal, the baseless accusations, the drawn weapon, and now the shocking reality of being treated like a criminal when he had done nothing wrong. Suddenly the door creaked open and a uniformed officer entered, his expression bleak and cold as he dropped a folder onto the table. Identification, he demanded without preamble. Jaden's voice came out shaky and barely audible. He reached into his pocket, as much as his restraints allowed, and handed over his ID. The officer took it without even glancing at Jaden, briefly inspecting the card before sliding it back across the table. "I want to make a phone call," Jaden said weakly, his voice cracking with exhaustion and tears. The officer stared at him for a moment, then sighed without saying anything, leaving the room. He returned a minute later with a phone, placing it on the table and unfastening one of Jaden's cuffs so he could dial. Trembling hands reached for the phone, fingers struggling to hit the correct buttons. After a few rings, his father picked up. "Jaden." Charles Allen's voice was sharp and immediately alert. The sound shattered whatever resolve Jaden had left. "Dad," he sobbed, tears falling hard now. "They shot Buddy. That officer said I made him attack, but I swear I didn't do anything." As he spoke, his words caught in his throat, overwhelmed by grief. There was a brief silence on the line, followed by his father's steady voice, calm but with an undercurrent of rage. "Where are you right now?" "At the police station," Jaden replied in a whisper, feeling the weight of helplessness. "Stay where you are." "I'm coming to get you," his father replied sharply. Jaden nodded silently, even though his father couldn't see him. The call ended with a click, and Jaden set the phone back on the table, his hands still shaking uncontrollably. For what felt like an eternity, he sat alone again. The silence in the room became heavier, the hum of the lights louder, the clock on the wall moving slower than it should. Every passing second felt like an hour, every noise from the hallway outside sending a jolt of hope through him that anyone was coming to set things right. Finally, the sound of heavy, purposeful footsteps echoed through the station. Jaden could hear his father's unmistakable voice booming from the front. "Where is my son?" Charles' voice rang out with authority, sharp and cutting through the air like a blade. Nearby officers scrambled to respond, their voices hushed as they tried to explain the situation. It wasn't long before the senior officer on duty, Captain Harris, stepped forward, trying to calm Charles. "Agent Allen, please, try to calm down," Captain Harris said, his voice placating as he approached. "What's the issue here?" he asked. But Charles didn't waver. His tall frame stood tense with anger, his face set in a deep scowl as he glared at the senior officer. "Where is my son?" he demanded, each word slow and deliberate, filled with authority. Captain Harris gestured quickly towards the holding room. "He's in there." "He was arrested for what?" Charles cut him off. "Explain to me why my son was arrested." Captain Harris faltered slightly, shaken by Charles's glare. "The officer involved said he attempted to make a dog attack him," he replied hesitantly, sensing the rising tension. Charles' expression darkened further. "That's not what happened," he asserted, stepping closer, his tone sharp as he spoke. "My son called me. He told me what happened. Your officer accused him of stealing his own dog and then drew a weapon. Who gave that officer the right to shoot an innocent animal?" Captain Harris looked momentarily taken aback, but quickly tried to regain control. "I'll get Officer Stevens in here to explain himself." Moments later, Officer Mark Stevens entered the room, his demeanor relaxed, hands casually tucked into his pockets, as though nothing significant had transpired. He offered a slight nod to Captain Harris before turning to Charles, his indifference palpable. "Care to explain why you arrested my son?" Charles asked, his voice steady, eyes burning with fury. Officer Stevens shrugged. "Your kid provoked the dog to attack me. I shot it for my safety, end of story," he stated flatly, his words dripping with self-justification. Charles didn't blink at Stevens' words. "That's not what my son told me," he replied evenly, unwavering in his stance. "And judging by the way you're talking, I think you're lying." Tension thickened in the air, but before Officer Stevens could argue, Captain Harris interjected. "Let's check the sect footage," he suggested cautiously, attempting to diffuse the brewing storm. "It'll show exactly what happened." Charles didn't respond to the suggestion. His expression, however, conveyed that he wouldn't settle for anything less than the truth. He stood silently as Captain Harris directed others to retrieve the footage, keeping a sharp gaze on Officer Stevens. For the first time, the officer seemed to falter, shifting uncomfortably under the weight of Charles's stare. In the quiet that followed, Jaden remained in the holding room, entirely unaware of the confrontation taking place on his behalf. His mind stayed fixed on Buddy, picturing the loyal companion who had only wanted to protect him. Closing his eyes, he felt tears streaming down his cheeks, grief and helplessness weighing him down. Meanwhile, Charles Daniels was just getting started. The senior officers gathered in a small, dimly lit conference room where the CCTV footage from the nearby street had been queued up on a large screen. The tension in the room thickened as Charles, Officer Stevens, Captain Harris, and several other personnel waited anxiously for the truth to unfold. The video began to play, the grainy yet clear footage flickering across the screen. It showed Jaden walking peacefully down the sidewalk with Buddy, who trotted happily beside him on the leash. Jaden's posture was relaxed, his attention focused on his dog as they moved along the tranquil street. Then, the moment arose, Officer Stevens' cruiser appeared on the edge of the screen, pulling up alongside Jaden. The officer exited the vehicle, approaching the teenager with an aggressive stance. The footage lacked sound, but the body language spoke volumes. Officer Stevens stood confrontationally in front of Jaden, gesturing toward Buddy, who remained calm by his side. The room watched in silence as the video displayed Jaden likely trying to explain himself, confusion written all over his face. Then came the moment of tension. Jaden knelt slightly as he issued a command, and Buddy barked obediently in response, nothing that resembled aggression. Yet, in stark contrast, Officer Stevens' reaction unraveled. His body tensed as he reached for his holstered gun. Gasps echoed in the room as the footage showed Jaden flinch back in alarm. Buddy sensed his owner's fear, barking defensively as the officer drew his weapon. The barking escalated, yet the footage clearly showed Buddy's restrained behavior. He didn't lunge, didn't attack, and remained firmly on his leash. Then came the shot, an event that froze the blood of everyone watching. The entire room tensed as the video captured the precise moment Officer Stevens fired his weapon. Buddy crumpled to the ground, the leash falling limply from Jaden's shaking hand. Jaden dropped to his knees beside Buddy, sobs visible even without sound as he cradled his motionless form. The footage ended abruptly, freezing on the heart-wrenching image of Jaden kneeling on the sidewalk, face hidden by shadows, shoulders shaking with grief. For a long moment, no one spoke. The only sound in the room was the faint hum of the screen as that still image lingered. Charles Daniels stood at the front, shoulders squared, eyes locked on Captain Harris. His face was stone, impassive yet brimming with barely restrained fury. Finally, Captain Harris broke the silence, clearing his throat, and his voice carried an edge of discomfort as he turned toward Officer Stevens, his expression stern and unyielding. "Does this match the story you gave me earlier?" Stevens shifted uneasily under the weight of evidence now against him. His earlier bravado was gone, replaced with visible discomfort. He opened his mouth to explain but found no words. "I thought you didn't think," Captain Harris snapped, his tone hardening. He jabbed a finger toward the frozen image on the screen. "You escalated that situation. The boy did nothing wrong, and you shot an innocent animal in front of him." Officer Stevens dropped his gaze to the floor, hands clenched tightly at his sides, trying to gather his thoughts. It looked like the dog was going to attack, he muttered weakly, though his voice held little conviction. Charles stepped forward, his presence commanding as he addressed the room, his voice quietly seething yet measured. "The footage speaks for itself," he said coolly. "My son was walking his own dog, minding his own business. This officer profiled him, accused him of theft without cause, and drew a weapon on a loyal animal that was merely responding to its owner. And then he arrested my son for his own reckless actions." Turning his gaze directly onto Captain Harris, his sharp eyes bore into the senior officer, demanding accountability. "What are you going to do about this?" Captain Harris straightened his back, lips pressed into a thin line. "This is clear misconduct. You overreacted and used unnecessary force," he stated firmly. "You've disgraced this department." Officer Stevens' face turned pale, mouth opening and closing as he searched for a defense. "I thought I was in danger," he stammered weakly, but it was clear to everyone in that room that no one believed him. Charles shook his head, cutting through Stevens' feeble words. "My son was never a threat to you, and that dog, he was his best friend." His voice hardened further as he added, "You don't get to hide behind excuses, not this time." Captain Harris stepped forward, making a decision. "Officer Stevens, you're relieved of duty effective immediately. Pending a full review of this incident," he announced, taking control of the situation. "You'll be suspended without pay while the department conducts its investigation." Officer Stevens looked stunned, seemingly unable to process the consequences of his actions. His shoulders slumped as Captain Harris' words sank in. But Charles wasn't finished. He stepped closer to Captain Harris, voice calm yet deadly serious. "Suspension isn't enough. I'm filing a formal complaint for misconduct, negligence, and false arrest. My son will not carry the weight of your officer's actions." Captain Harris nodded solemnly. "Understood, Agent Allen. The department will fully cooperate with your complaint and the investigation." With that, Charles turned on his heel and left the room without another word. Each officer in the room remained silent, watching him go. Outside the conference room, Jaden sat quietly in the hallway, head hung low under the weight of everything that had transpired. When Charles approached, he gently rested a hand on his son's shoulder, a firm yet comforting grip. "They saw the truth," he assured softly, his voice soothing. "This isn't over, but I promise you, you're not alone in this." Jaden looked up, red-rimmed eyes meeting his father's. There was a faint glimmer of relief amidst the sorrow, but the loss of Buddy still weighed heavily on his heart. Knowing the truth was coming to light brought him a small measure of comfort. Together they exited the station, Charles' resolve unwavering. He would see this through not just for Jaden, but to ensure that justice was served. The case proceeded swiftly to court, where the events of that tragic day were laid bare for all to see. Jaden sat quietly alongside his father, shoulders tense as the proceedings began. Officer Stevens stood at the defendant's table, his face grim yet defiant. The prosecution wasted no time presenting the evidence. The CCTV footage played on a large screen before the judge, revealing every moment: the peaceful walk, the unprovoked confrontation, and ultimately the devastating shot that ended Buddy's life. The courtroom remained silent as the video played, the tension palpable. Jaden sat still, hands clenched tightly in his lap, watching the painful events unfold once more. Though watching was excruciating, it was undeniable proof of his innocence. Witnesses took the stand one by one, each testimony weaving a tale of injustice. Charles recounted Jaden's tearful call, the anguish that had ensued following the shooting, and the actions that led to his wrongful arrest. Each piece of testimony added weight to the truth, dismantling Officer Stevens' initial claims. As Officer Stevens was finally called to testify, his earlier arrogance began to fade under skilled questioning. He attempted to defend his actions, claiming self-defense and confusion. However, the footage and evidence left his arguments weak and hollow. The courtroom listened in cold silence as his justifications unraveled further under each probing question. The judge, having seen and heard enough, addressed the room with finality. His voice was calm but resolute as he delivered his verdict. The court found Officer Stevens guilty of using unnecessary force and engaging in professional misconduct. Jaden's arrest was declared unlawful, and all accusations against him were officially dismissed. Officer Stevens' punishment was clear. He was suspended from duty for 1 month without pay and placed under internal review, leaving his future in law enforcement uncertain. The judge's ruling, though measured, reflected the court's acknowledgement of wrongdoing. After the gavel fell and the proceedings concluded, Charles stood beside Jaden as they exited the courthouse. A quiet crowd had gathered outside, many waiting to hear the outcome. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashing, but Charles ignored them, keeping his focus on his son. Jaden walked with his head held high, though his expression remained somber. Charles placed a steady hand on Jaden's shoulder, leaning slightly closer. "We'll get through this," he said, his voice calm but filled with the quiet determination that had carried them this far. Jaden nodded, his gaze fixed ahead. Though the court's decision had brought accountability, it did little to ease the ache in his chest. Buddy's absence was a void that could never be filled, and the memory of his loyal companion's final moments weighed heavily on his heart. As they made their way to a quieter part of the street, away from the noise and flashing cameras, Charles stopped and turned to face his son fully. "What happened to Buddy wasn't right," he said softly, "but we made sure they couldn't bury the truth. That matters." Jaden swallowed hard, grief still raw in his eyes as he met his father's gaze. He nodded again, understanding the significance of what they had achieved together. They had faced injustice head-on and fought tirelessly to hold those responsible accountable. As father and son walked forward, side by side, Jaden allowed himself a moment to breathe. Though Buddy was gone, the fight for justice had not been in vain. In a world where prejudice could steal so much, Jaden and Charles had proven that the truth, no matter how painful, was always worth standing for. Disclaimer: this story is entirely fictional and created for awareness purposes. It highlights issues of accountability, justice, and the importance of treating everyone with respect and dignity. We firmly stand against violence, prejudice, and injustice in any form. Viewer discretion is advised.